Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today I'll tell you a quiet, warm-hearted story from Russia, a tale of poverty and goodness, of compassion, and of a question as old as humankind itself. What Men Live by Leo Tolstoy, written in the year 1881. It is the story of a poor shoemaker who one winter evening finds a stranger by the roadside, and the story of that stranger who carries a secret with him. A tale that, in the end, gives a consoling answer. Make yourself comfortable, let go of the day, and come along. In a Russian village, there lived a shoemaker named Simon, a poor man who dwelt with his wife Matryona and their children in a rented cottage. He owned neither house nor land, and what he earned with his work was barely enough for the bare necessities. Bread was dear, work was badly paid, and everything he took in went for food. They had only a single sheepskin coat for the cold season, which he and his wife wore by turns, and even this had by now grown so threadbare that it hung in tatters. For 2 winters already, Simon had been saving to be able at last to buy sheepskins for a new coat, and now, toward autumn, he had a little money together. 3 rubles lay in the chest, and besides that, the peasants in the village still owed him 5 rubles and 20 kopecks. So one morning, Simon set out for the village to collect his debts and to buy the skins with the money. But the day went otherwise than he had hoped. One peasant was not at home, another put him off until later, a third had no money and promised it for next week. In the end, Simon had received only 20 kopecks from all of them together, and no one had handed over the rest. Downcast and vexed at the fruitless errand, Simon wanted at least to console himself a little. He went into the tavern and spent the 20 kopecks on a glass of vodka. Then he set out for home, without skins, without money, with nothing in his hands but his empty pockets and a gloomy mind. It had grown cold, and the frost bit through his thin coat. Yet the vodka warmed him from within, and so he strode along, beat his arms, thought about his hardship and about the trouble there would be at home when he stepped before Matryona without the new coat. As Simon was walking along, he came to a bend in the road where a small chapel stood, and there, behind the chapel, he saw something white glimmering in the twilight. He drew nearer and stopped in fright. Against the wall of the chapel, a man was sitting, naked and motionless, his back leaning against the stone. He did not stir, and Simon could not tell whether he was alive or dead. A terror ran through his limbs. What kind of man might that be, he thought. Surely nothing good. If I go to him, he may yet bring me to grief. And how am I to help him, naked and penniless as I am myself? And so fear came over him, and he walked on, past the stranger, and left him behind. But when he had gone a little way, his heart grew heavy. He stopped and rebuked himself. "What are you doing, Simon?" he said to himself. "There sits a man dying, and you walk past and save your own skin? Have you grown so rich, then, that you fear to be robbed of your goods?" And suddenly he felt so deeply ashamed that he turned about and went back to the chapel. He stepped up to the stranger and looked at him more closely. He was a young man, strongly built, without wounds or signs of violence, yet he was frozen through to the bone and seemed to be stiffening with cold. He sat there, leaning against the wall, and did not look at Simon. Then Simon spoke to him and asked who he was and what had befallen him. The stranger raised his head with effort, opened his eyes, and looked at Simon. And in that look there lay something that gripped the shoemaker's heart and drove away all his fear. He answered only that he was not from here, and that God had punished him. He said no more. Simon asked no further. He took off his own coat, wrapped the freezing man in it, gave him his boots, and helped him to his feet. The stranger could hardly stand, and Simon supported him, and so the two set out for Simon's house. Matryona was waiting. She had heated the stove, prepared the evening meal, and cut the last of the bread, for she expected her husband with the new skins and hoped for a good end to the day. But when she saw through the window that Simon was not coming alone, but had a strange man with him, who on top of that was wearing Simon's own coat and boots, anger rose in her. She saw at once that he was bringing neither skins nor money, and that he had evidently been to the tavern, for as soon as he entered, she smelled the vodka, and her vexation broke out. She scolded and railed. She reproached Simon for having drunk away the last of the money, for leaving them without a coat for the winter, and for dragging home a strange vagabond besides, who would have to be fed, when there was scarcely enough for themselves. She would not give him the bread. She wanted to put the stranger out the door. Simon tried to calm her, and said to her what lay upon his heart. "Matryona, have you then no love for God?" The stranger meanwhile sat silent on the bench, did not stir, and looked at the floor. And then it happened. Matryona looked at the stranger, and all at once something changed within her. She saw the young man sitting there, quiet, exhausted, without complaint, and suddenly her anger fell away from her, and her heart softened. She went to the stove, fetched the bread, poured kvass, a traditional Slavic drink, set everything on the table, and invited the stranger to eat. She even set before him the last of what they had, and in that moment, as Matryona handed him the food, the stranger raised his head for the first time and smiled. It was a quiet, scarcely perceptible smile, yet Simon and his wife both noticed it, and it was as though a light went out from him. They asked him his name, and he called himself Michael. Where he came from and how he had come to be there, that he would not say, and they asked no further. And so Michael stayed that night in the shoemaker's house. The next morning Michael awoke, and Simon asked him whether he would stay in the house and work, for he could use a pair of hands. Michael consented. Simon showed him how to twist the waxed thread, how to cut the leather, and how to stitch, and the stranger proved to be of an astonishing quickness of understanding. Whatever Simon showed him, he grasped it on the spot. By the third day already, Michael worked as though he had done nothing else all his life. He was diligent, ate little, and never complained. When there was no work, he sat quietly on the bench and gazed before him. He never went out into the street, spoke no superfluous word, did not jest, and did not laugh. Only that one time, on the first evening, when Matryona had handed him the food, had he been seen to smile. So one day passed after another, 1 week after another, and at last a whole year. And the time brought a blessing to the shoemaker's household. For Michael's work was of a neatness and durability such as was not known in the whole region. Soon word got about that far and wide there was no better shoemaker than Simon's journeyman, and people came from everywhere to have boots made by him. The business flourished, and Simon, who before had scarcely been able to earn his daily bread, came little by little to a modest prosperity. Want departed from the house. And yet Michael remained a riddle to the two of them. He lived under their roof, shared their bread and their work, and still they knew nothing of him, where he came from, what had befallen him, why he was so silent and so grave. They did not ask him, for they sensed that he did not wish to say, and they were grateful for what he had brought them. So they lived together, year after year, and the quiet Michael became as familiar to them as a brother, without their ever learning who he truly was. One winter, Simon and Michael were sitting at the window at their work when the sound of sleigh bells rang out. A 3-horse team drew up before the house. A servant sprang down from the box and opened the carriage door, and out stepped a gentleman of rank in a costly fur coat. He came toward the house, and Matryona hurried up and flung open the door for him. The gentleman had to stoop to enter, and when he straightened up inside, his head almost touched the ceiling, so tall and broad was he. He filled half the room. Simon bowed and marveled, for he had never seen such a man in his poor workshop. The gentleman was a powerful, well-fed man with a red face and a neck like a bull, and he spoke loudly and imperiously. He had his servant bring in a bundle of leather, threw it on the table, and declared that this was the finest foreign ware, bought for 20 rubles. From it, Simon was to make him a pair of boots, high boots with tall shafts, and such as would last a whole year without warping or bursting at the seams. If he could not manage it, he had better say so at once and keep his hands off. But if he ruined the costly leather, he would pay for it. Simon hesitated, for he knew the value of the material and the strictness of the order. But then he looked over at Michael, and Michael nodded to him. So Simon accepted the order. The gentleman, however, went on boasting and spoke of his health and his strength, and that he had no thought yet of growing old. Michael had not said a word the whole time. He sat there and looked past the gentleman, into the corner behind him, as though he saw something there that no one else could see. And all at once he smiled. It was the second time that Simon and Matryona saw him smile, and it was a quiet smile, and again a light seemed to go out from him. Simon was startled and wanted to rebuke him, for it was not fitting to smile before so exalted a customer. But the gentleman noticed nothing of it, stamped out, climbed into his sleigh, and drove away. When the gentleman was gone, Michael set to work. Matryona came near and watched him, for she understood something of the craft, and what she saw astonished her. Michael did not cut the costly leather for high boots with tall shafts, as the gentleman had demanded, but for light, flat shoes. She wanted to ask him, but then she thought she must have misunderstood, and Michael would surely know better, and so she did not interfere. But Michael went on stitching, and he stitched the thread single, as one does with light shoes, and not double, as is necessary for boots. Again Matryona wondered, and again she kept silent. When noon came, Simon rose from his bench, stepped up, and saw what Michael had made, and the shock ran through his limbs. Out of the costly leather of the gentleman of rank, Michael had stitched no boots, but a pair of grave shoes, those soft, light slippers that are put on the dead. Simon was aghast. "A whole year," he cried. "Michael has worked with me and never made a mistake, and now he ruins the precious leather. What am I to say to the gentleman? Such leather is nowhere to be had." But before he could speak further, there was a knock at the door. Outside stood the servant of that very gentleman who had just been with them. He entered and brought a message. The gentleman, he said, was no longer alive. On the way home, still in the sleigh, death had overtaken him, and when they tried to lift him out at home, he had already grown stiff. Now the lady had sent him, and she had this to say: the boots were no longer needed, but out of the same leather, grave shoes should be made as quickly as possible, and he, the servant, was to wait until they were finished. Simon stood as though turned to stone. But Michael laid the finished shoes on the table, those grave shoes he had stitched before anyone knew of the gentleman's death, and handed them to the messenger. Again years went by. Michael went on living and working in the shoemaker's house, quiet and diligent as before. And Simon and Matryona no longer asked him about his secret, although they had long known that he was no ordinary man. 6 years had now passed since Simon had found him freezing by the chapel. One day the two men were again sitting at their work when a woman appeared before the window, a well-dressed townswoman, and with her 2 little girls. They came in, and the woman asked whether shoes could be made for her children. The two girls were twins, so alike that one could scarcely tell them apart, and both pretty and healthy. Only one thing was noticeable. On one of the girls, a foot was crooked and turned askew. Simon took the measurements, and while he worked, the talk came round to the children. He asked the woman about them, and she told her story. She was not the girl's natural mother. The children were orphans. Their father had died before they came into the world, and their mother had given birth to them and passed away the same day. When the mother died, she had in her dying rolled onto one of the children, and in this way the little one's foot had been injured and left crooked. There had been no one there to take in the orphans, and so she, the neighbor, had taken the two to herself and raised them like her own children. She had at that time had an infant of her own and had nursed all three together, and her own child had later died. But these two had remained to her, and she loved them more than her life. While the woman was telling this, Michael had stopped working. He sat there, his hands in his lap, and looked at the woman and the two girls, and over his face there passed a radiance. And then he smiled. It was the third time that Simon and Matryona saw him smile, and this time the light that went out from him grew so bright that the whole room seemed filled with it. When the woman had gone with the two girls, Michael rose. He laid his work aside, took off his apron, bowed deeply before Simon and Matryona, and said, "Forgive me, master and mistress. God has forgiven me, so do you also forgive me." And the shoemaker and his wife saw that a light went out from Michael. Then Simon bowed before him and spoke, "I see well, Michael, that you are no ordinary man. I will not hold you back and will ask you nothing. Only tell me this one thing. Why were you so gloomy when I found you? And why did you smile 3 times and grow brighter each time?" Then Michael answered and told them everything. He was an angel of God, he said, and God had punished him because he had not carried out his charge. He had been sent to fetch the soul of a dying mother. But when he came to her, she had implored him to let her live, for her newly born twins had neither father nor kin, and without her the children must perish. Then he had felt pity, and had not taken her soul, but had returned without it. God, however, had sent him down again, and charged him now to fetch the soul after all. And as a punishment for his disobedience, he was to remain on earth until he had learned 3 truths: what dwells in men, what is not given to men, and what men live by. And so he had been left naked and alone upon the earth. And the 3 truths, said Michael, he had now learned. "The first I learned," he said, "when your wife gave me food, although she was angry and had scarcely enough herself. Then I saw what dwells in men, and it is love. Therefore I smiled the first time. The second I learned when the rich gentleman ordered boots to last a whole year, and did not know that he would not live to see the evening. For behind him stood the angel of death, and I alone saw him. Then I understood what is not given to men. It is not given them to know what they themselves need. No man knows whether in the evening he will need boots or grave shoes. Therefore I smiled the second time. And the third I learned today, when I saw the 2 girls, for whose sake I once wished to leave the mother her life. I had believed they must perish without their mother. And now I saw them healthy and well cared for, raised by a stranger who loves them like her own. Then I understood what men live by. They live not by care for themselves, but by love. Whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him, for God is love. When Michael had said this, his light filled the whole house, and Simon and Matryona sank down before him. But Michael was released, and he returned to the place from which he had come. That was our short retelling of What Men Live by Leo Tolstoy, a quiet story of poverty and goodness, of an angel who lived among men, and of the simple, consoling answer to a great question, that we live not by care for ourselves, but by love. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow, here at Sleepy Classic Tales.